In a company culture, if you want people to be trained to hear the intent behind the words, and you accept for a moment that, well, maybe they're not going to be adequately trained, then what's their outlet? Where do they go?
Business is messy and unpredictable.
Sometimes lonely.
So lonely.
So lonely.
And inspiration can often come from really weird places.
We pick up where the bullet point blogs and the highlight reels leave off.
We start with the stories. Welcome back to So Here's My Story. I'm Jody.
I'm Elliot. And today, Jody brings a story about not just communication, which we're all about, but when communication should stop, when listening and other communication should start. And we get into this discussion, which really exemplifies the saying that the opposite of love isn't hate. It's apathy.
Yeah. And so if you love us,
nice.
Here's how you can take action. If you love us, please share, tell your friends, post on Facebook. I don't know, get a billboard. We don't care. And if you want to sort of hop on the train and find out all the things going on behind the scenes, you can text the word story to 345-345, and that will sort of gloss the way into you getting into the Facebook group.
Excellent. You ready?
Yep. So here's my story. My dad is one of the just the kindest, most patient human beings on the entire planet. And he has so many gifts and wonderful things about him, but he is the worst compliment giver on the planet. It is painful to get a compliment from my father.
Well, that's fine with me, somebody who doesn't like compliments to begin with.
Right, exactly. His compliments, they always mean well, and I can always hear the intent behind the compliment, but you literally have to brace yourself. And so my mom called me this morning, and she was laughing so hard she almost couldn't tell me the story. But it started with, she said, Jody, your father complimented me this morning. And I said, oh my God, I'm so sorry. How did it go? And she goes, oh, it's the best one yet. I said, okay. So she said they were getting ready for church, and she's like looking in the mirror, doing her makeup or whatever. And what he said was, and it gets even better after this. What he said was, oh, you look so beautiful. I almost didn't recognize you.
Nice.
And she laughs hysterically because, I mean, the thing is, we know, we love him so much. We know the intent. We are trained to hear the intent behind the words. But of course, it's like, wow. She's laughed. She said, I can't believe you just said that. That's, I hear you. Thank you for the compliment. She's like, but that was a bad one. He goes, oh, and this is why I wanted to use it as an episode. He goes, well, he's like, and he looked forlorn at this moment. He goes, but it was so much better than what I first thought. He's like, I revised it in my head before I said it. And she literally said, so I braced myself. I said, tell me what the first version was. He said, my first version was, you look so beautiful. What did you do with my wife?
Nice.
So at least he recognized that, like, that was terrible.
That's probably not a good.
That's not a good. So he reached for something better, which was, I didn't recognize you. Of course, clearly missing the whole point that any kind of this looks nothing like you normally look is just going to be bad. There's no version of that. But could have just stuck with, you look so beautiful. End of story. Period. Done. Right there. But in addition to this just being a hysterical storyline in my family, I immediately thought of all the times that I've been trying to like manage or mentor someone, and how you move someone through this. You know, like, my dad wants to be better at compliments. He's trying. He clearly, as exemplified right there, the best you can hope for someone on a performance plan or something is to like recognize that, you know, they've heard you. He has a level
of insight.
Right. Yeah. They've done a bad thing. You've given them feedback that is not the right way to do it. They've heard it. They've internalized it. They're trying. They make an effort, still failing miserably. How you nurture someone along that path when you just call it. Now, we're not going to call it and throw my dad out for this, but, with employees, sometimes, this came up actually twice this week with clients where they have somebody they've been mentoring, they've been working with, I'm part of this conversation because they've actually called me in to help work with this person about a thing. Like, when do you just say, yes, this person's trying, but they are never going, like, if it's my dad's job to be the compliment person at a company, at some point,
reassigned.
Yeah, at some point we have to realize that this is not a good job for you.
And it could be his dream, but you still have to reassign.
It's like, I know this is what you've always wanted to be, but you are never going to be this person after a certain amount of time. So I just kind of wanted to open up that conversation. And also, I just wanted to tell that story.
Well, So it's really interesting to me because one of the first things you said, and I wrote it down, was that you've been trained to hear the intent behind the words.
Yes.
And so that speaks to me about not only the training and the coaching that the person in your dad's position would have, right? Because there have been enough conversations where he's developed the insight and he understands the need to improve and to self-edit to the extent that he's able to do that. But also there's been a degree of training and insight on the audience to understand where he's coming from, where he's trying to go, and what he's trying to accomplish.
Oh, that's such a great point. Because I mean, if we keep this metaphor going, I'm sort of setting it up as if I'm his manager or supervisor.
Right. Yes.
And in that case, if I am someone who hasn't built the skill of being able to go, okay, I hear what you were trying to do there. If I just reacted and was like, damn it, Dan, you did it again. And I'm furious and I don't hear the intent, he is not going to be, interestingly, he probably wouldn't have gotten so far along this path as he is because he would just be frustrated that you misunderstood him. And I remember as a kid, I remember my mom bought me this, my mom being worried about me being cold in Baltimore at college, bought me this like below the knee, puffy quilted, like the super puffy quilted coats, like, you know, they're like 4 inches
fetching.
thick. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I mean, it was, you know, what's that? Not the snowman, but the puff.
The Michelin.
The Michelin, very Michelin managed. And, you know, I'm 5'3" and I'm really curvy. So if you put basically like a really thick quilt that goes from shoulder to like mid calf, I just look, it has nothing to do with being fat. Like it's just, you are going to look fat and So I was standing in the mirror and it's like my freshman year in college. And I was like, this coat, and I literally said, this coat makes me look huge, because it did, just it's lines. It's just whatever. I didn't say I am huge. I actually felt really good about myself at that point. And my dad comes in again. And I remember he got so frustrated when I was put off by this, because what he said was, I said, I look so huge in this coat. And he's like, but Jody, you're not a stick thin model. You're our Jody.
There you go.
And I remember, because I was basically a teenager, being like, oh, and rolling my eyes. And he was so like hurt. And he's like, you know what I meant? I was just, and I was like, I do know what you meant. But in that moment, he just reacted. And because I reacted, so he reacted. And there was no learning. There was no, and as I grew up, I could hear the fact that he wanted me to feel a thing or see a thing a different way. And so over the years, we learned to hear that. And I think it's probably why he has gotten better, because we laugh with love and are able to say, I know I know what you were trying to say. I hear you. Thank you. Now let's work on how it was delivered.
Yeah. And I think that what's often missing, even in companies or organizations that train managers on how to give feedback, etc., what's often missing is a culture of how to accept the feedback, the spirit in which to accept the feedback, the training to hear the intent behind the words. And I worked with somebody who would often fail to put the period where it should be. They would say something like, you did a great job with this. I'm really surprised.
Oh.
Okay. And which is a literal example. I mean, that's actually happened. And what they meant was, well, I know I gave you something that's completely outside your comfort zone. I expected that you would struggle with this. And you actually knocked it out of the park on your first try. And not many people can do that. And that's great.
Yes.
That's all the things that this supervisor had meant to say. But what the person getting feedback came back with is, well, you expected incompetence and you were surprised that you didn't get that.
Yeah.
And so your overall impression of me is that I am incompetent and this was a fluke.
Yeah, I find myself saying it so often that it feels a little bit on my list of one-trick ponies, which I guess makes it, if it's a list, it's not one trick.
Unless it's a short list.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, that looking for the intent, seeing through to the intent, doesn't mean you have to accept the behavior. I mean, I could still laugh at my dad for saying this, but hearing the intent or noticing what somebody was trying to do and acknowledging that, and then addressing the gap or the misstep or whatever, it goes so far, because on that, and then also the hearing the best intent from when you're getting the feedback, it really goes on both ways, because the person giving the feedback has to first start off by seeing that great intent and then just giving directive feedback on the other part. It helps how you deliver it. But then even sometimes if that's done really, really well, if the person hearing the feedback doesn't look for the intent behind it and not just the words, that's where so much miscommunication goes wrong because people are reacting and they're not. I mean, a lot of times when somebody tells me a story of a frustration about someone on their team, I can hear it's like painful because I can hear what the person was trying to do. I was like, oh, I could see how they thought that was a great thing. Yes, it wasn't. Because imagine that if you've gotten feedback that you need to do something differently, or even if you haven't, you're just trying to do the right thing. You think it's the right thing. You're pretty excited and pumped that you've done this thing. And you're like, I bet you my dad was really proud of himself when he rewrote that thing in his head this morning. He's like, check me out. I'm going to do this really, really well. It fell short. If you don't acknowledge the intent in it and you just smack the person's fingers, I think we've all been there where you're like, you didn't even notice that I did this other thing. You can't even hear that constructive feedback if you don't feel acknowledged for the part you were at least trying to do, even if it didn't go well.
Right. And so what your mom did, I know this is after a lot of years, so she can shortcut it. But what she did was she initiated a conversation afterward and could tease out where he fell short, but also the fact that she understood the intent. And so it was in good humor. And so in the example that I gave about, you did a great job with this, I'm really surprised, because this incident that was discussed at the management meeting where I was, the person went back to her office and was very, very upset because she felt that the image that this partner had, and of course then the rest of the firm had, was that she's incompetent and that, it was a fluke that she did well. If we had developed our company culture to the point, and she had bought into the company culture to the point where if something didn't strike her right, she felt empowered enough to come back or to respond and say, this is how I took this. Or do you believe that I would approach something from the expected result of my efforts would be incompetent or incompetence? But we did not have that culture created at that point. Maybe we didn't even perceive the need to create it at that point. She certainly, even if we did, she certainly did not feel, it didn't reach her. She didn't feel empowered to do that.
Right. And even if you have that kind of culture and you've made it very clear, the first time someone's feelings are hurt, they're going to have a really limited capacity to act on that, because that is a hard hurdle to step over to go to somebody and say, because your risk there is, you say because keep in mind, that thing that the way she heard it didn't feel like a maybe. So the risk you have, and say, if you knew for a fact that was not the case, then going back for a second bite at that apple, it doesn't feel so threatening. If you knew that if you said, gosh, it feels like you think I'm incompetent, and you knew for a fact that they would say, oh, no, we meant this, then yeah, maybe that's not so scary. But you really risk the answer being, yeah, we do think you're incompetent. I'm glad you heard that.
Right.
Because you don't, in that moment, you're not considering that it's possible that you are wrong. That's the feeling you have. And therefore it is truth. So it takes, I bring this up because I've worked with several companies where they say that. They say, we have a culture where if you don't, they'll say it over and over and over and over and over again. And the leader will be frustrated because they said, I told that, someone quits because of a thing. And at the exit interview, they hear a story like this where somebody was hurt or upset. And they'll say, I say it all the time. If you feel like you've been wronged, or if something's bad, I'll say, come to us. I encourage people all the time to come to us. And I think what you don't realize is, even with all that language, sometimes you have to kind of tease it out of people, safely draw it out, because that's a hard thing to stand up and say.
Well, it is. And there are a couple thoughts that I have on that. And one is, so let's say that in my organization, if I had said this and I really inadvertently, but actually insulted somebody, and they went back to their office and they were really upset because they took what I was trying to say in a way that I wasn't trying, I didn't mean it. And let's say that they didn't feel that they didn't know me well, they didn't feel that they could come back in and discuss that. One of the advantages I hope that we have is that they know, well, if I can't talk to Elliot, I can talk to Kim. and I can say, hey, what did Elliot mean by this? Or do you think this? So there's some other outlet. There's somebody else that they can go to express the concern if they can't quite get to the level of a direct confrontation.
Yeah.
And, Baltimore County used to have a program, and I'm disappointed that it wasn't really expanded. It was instead dismantled because they didn't perceive that it was used well. But the intention behind it, I thought, was brilliant. And it was called the Alter Ego Program. And that is, if I have a problem with the judge, and I think, let's say, well, more to the point, let's say I think the judge has a problem with me.
Oh, okay.
Doesn't like me, for whatever reason, I think this judge is out to get me, which, is a very dangerous place to be in a litigator. If you're in Baltimore County and you've only got X number of judges, it's not like, well, what are the odds I'm going to get that person?
Yeah, but I have to imagine if you make that accusation and the judge says no, now you have a judge who probably is against you.
Now because what you're saying to that judge is, I think that you are not deciding on the merits. I think you are deciding emotionally improperly, and you are coming against me because we have a personal problem.
Which I have to assume is like the worst thing you can accuse
pretty much, other than taking bribes, that's pretty much the worst thing you can do. So Baltimore County had unveiled this Alter Ego program where the judges would, and I may have some of the details wrong because I wasn't involved in creating the program, but my understanding is the judges would designate people who are like close friends or long-term law partners of them before they were appointed to the bench, that if I have a problem with Judge A, I could go to Susan Smith or whatever. And I could say, Susan, I know you're really close to this judge. And am I getting this wrong? But I think that I really rubbed this judge the wrong way. I don't know what I can do about it. I don't know if it's all in my head. What do you think? Now, Susan could say, well, here's the care and feeding of this judge. You have to understand how he or she means these things, and no, that's just the way they express it. And I've seen this 1,000 times before. It's still more dangerous if Susan goes to the judge and say, hey, by the way, I heard from Elliot, and Elliot said, right. So you don't want that. So I think that in Baltimore County, there was kind of confusion. It was a great idea, but there was confusion on how to implement it.
Yeah.
But the point that I'm making is that in a company culture, if you want people to be trained to hear the intent behind the words, and you accept for a moment that, well, maybe they're not going to be adequately trained, then what's their outlet? Where do they go? Right.
Especially because, and I think this is an important point to not step over. What you're asking, because what has happened, to use a little metaphor here, is you tried to hand them an orange, and they when they got it into their hand, they felt like it was an apple. Like they heard it differently than how you intended.
Yep.
And so they went back to their office and they're staring at an apple. And what you're asking people to do, what you're trying to create a culture of, is if you're holding an apple, and this of course presumes that you hate apples, I guess, like we have to sort of make an apple a bad thing. That if you're holding an apple, that you have to put yourself through the conscious act of saying, is this really an apple? Because when these things happen, it doesn't feel like a maybe. And you're asking
It's so
them,
obvious what you're looking at.
Yes, because it landed with like a 2x4.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't feel like it deserves questioning, or like assuming best intent sounds good. Everybody shakes their head and said, yeah, of course. But I don't think people realize how much it is a like wedge crowbar that you have to jam into a thing that doesn't have room for it because it feels like a truth. So you're asking somebody to say like, is this really an apple? I mean, everything about it feels like an apple to me, but I have to like, maybe I'm missing something here. Maybe there's something I'm not seeing. And so, yeah, because once that has happened, then what do you do with that possibility? And if we haven't had the kind of relationship where I can come to you, then it's great if you've established where there's another person that you can talk to or check in with. But sometimes it also means, as the leader, if you had handed me this thing and now I'm holding an apple, hopefully the person who said the thing is self-aware enough to notice that like, now I'm not making eye contact all the time, or suddenly I'm just sort of answering very shortly, and to have the skills to come in and say like, hey, just curious, what's up? Like I feel, but that is such a, a lot of times people are like, oh, everything's fine. I'm fine. Because it's so threatening to say, like, I'm really upset about the apple that you handed me. And you're like, what are you? No, oh my God, no. That wasn't an apple. That was an orange. You're like, what? So assuming best intent sounds so great, but it is hard work, because I've seen that spiral even more where I'm not making eye contact. I'm being short. And then that person doesn't assume best intent. And they're like, what's their problem? Now they're not engaged. They don't care about the company. And these things, I often end up kind of unraveling these things back a step, back a step, back a step, back a step, sometimes to something that happened a year ago that has set off this just long slinky going down a stair, this long chain reaction of yuck that builds up.
Yeah. And what I see a lot is that so many companies focus on, when they think about training at all, what they focus on are the nuts and bolts of somebody's job, whether it's reading financial statements or managing construction projects or whatever it happens to be, assessing risk and underwriting. But there are so many facets of just communication training, trying to perceive the intent, learning the culture, having the insight to know that if somebody's not making the eye contact or answering briefly or is not contributing in meetings, that maybe the problem isn't that they're not engaged anymore and they should be tossed aside in favor of somebody who is. Maybe the problem is in a communication and something to be explored rather than avoided.
Yeah. Yeah. Because it's so interesting, because for somebody to be, it's almost like that quote that, the opposite of love is not hate, it's disinterest.
Yeah.
Like when somebody is so riled up about a thing that it can also show up as something sort of like disinterest, but it's not. It's that they're so overwhelmed by an emotional reaction to something that they have to sort of disengage. They have to pull back because they don't know what to do with all that stuff. And that's the part to notice when somebody doesn't know what to do with what they're thinking about. They have to sort of shunt it off to the side or something. So it can look like disengagement. But yeah, I mean, back to my dad, that is actually one of the things we have often said to him is like, maybe just say the one thing, like just like, you look so beautiful, period, at the end of the sentence.
Right. So hearkening back to an earlier episode, just say that. So that's our story.
But the discussion doesn't have to end here.
No, it does not.
In fact, we don't want it to.
No, we don't.
That is why we actually have our private Facebook group,
which we started to make sure that we could get your comments, your rants, your thoughts,
your stories. You can find links to that group as well as show notes and links to subscribe via email and how to find us just about anywhere you can possibly find podcasts at sohere'smystory.com.
And you can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at SHMS Podcast.
And since we know it takes a village.
Yes, it does.
We'd like to thank our village, our super talented, incredibly patient team.
And occasionally snarky team.
Yeah, but in the best of ways.
In the best
Lovingly
of ways.
Snarky.
Yes.
Good mockery.
So a huge shout out to the people who actually help us produce our show. First, our sound engineer, Tom Hansen.
Thanks to Christy Schmier for our brilliant show notes and all the other fantastic writing she does for us.
And to Taylor Mathauer for doing just a little bit of everything.
Including wrangling us.
Which
is no small feat.
No, it's not.
This is Jody Hume.
And I'm Elliot Wagenheim.
And you've been listening to So Here's My Story.